podcast. My name is Jen, and I'm the blogger at Reappropriate.co. And I'm really excited today to have guest Byron Wong, who is a blogger at BigWoWo.com. And today we're going to be debating the question, should Asian Americans support or oppose affirmative action relative to college admissions or in general? So Byron, if you want to say hi and say a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, hi Jen. I'm Byron Wong. I'm happy to be here today. I am very thoroughly pleased to be the first, I think, Asian male on your podcast, and the first male is not your boyfriend. So
yeah, the first two episodes we were trying to get the technical difficulties out, so it was a lot easier to schedule someone I live with than someone else. So you're kind of my guinea pig in terms of people who are not my boyfriend. So, and also for the viewers just tuning in, I do want to go over a couple quick things. You are free to participate in the conversation. In fact, we welcome you to participate in the conversation at any point. You can tweet me at Reappropriate, which is on the bottom of the screen, or you can participate in the conversation by submitting questions through Google Hangouts using the question and answer app, and we will attempt to answer all of the questions on air. So we'd like to get started just by talking a little bit about affirmative action. And actually, I'm really excited to have Byron on the show today because for two reasons. The first is that Byron and I very much disagree on this topic in terms of affirmative action. And the second is that Byron and I actually have a pretty long history. We both have been blogging in the Asian American blogosphere for, what 10 years? And yeah, something like that, right? And actually, this is our second podcast together. I don't know if you remember, Byron. We did one a long time ago, and I found your write-up about it a few months back, where you wrote, I think we were talking about feminism or sexism or something.
Was it the Fallout Central one, or did we do another one in addition to that?
It might have been the Fallout Central one, but in any event, Byron and I have been sort of blogging colleagues for a really long time. And in addition, Byron and I actually went to the same school. We're both alums of Cornell University, isn't that right?
That's correct.
Yeah. What college did you graduate from?
I was Arts and Sciences.
Same here. So we were both Arts and Sciences.
Mm-hmm.
So I think given how similar we are, Byron, I think it's really interesting that we actually have very different opinions on the question, should Asian Americans support or oppose affirmative action? So, Byron, maybe you might want to talk a little bit about which side you fall.
Well, I saw the topic after I agreed to the podcast, and I'm still agreeing with the podcast. I'm really happy to be here. But I don't think that's really, for me, that's not really the right question to ask, because should Asian Americans support affirmative action? It should be more, should people support affirmative action? Because if, for example, we were to say that affirmative action is harmful to one group of people and it's beneficial to another, you can't make decisions on whether or not you support something based on your own self-interest. And so I think the question for me is, should people support affirmative action? Is it beneficial or harmful to people in general? And so that's the question I ask. And for me, the answer is no, people should not support affirmative action.
So you think that affirmative action is actually damaging to all people involved? I actually wanted to bring up one of the questions that Snoopy Jenkins, who, yes, is my boyfriend, kindly submitted some questions for me tonight. And one
is he going to be popping his head in, or is he...
No, he's tweeting, and possibly the live viewer who's watching, I'm not sure.
Oh, okay.
Anyways, Snoopy Jenkins submitted one of two Twitter questions, and he asked, doesn't the argument that Asians lose from affirmative action assume that Asian Americans deserve public investment over... Actually, sorry, this is the wrong one. He asked, at what point does the anti-SCA5 argument require racial tribalism as its foundation? And I think that gets to your point right there, Byron, whether or not the question over affirmative action is about tribalism, and people are arguing based on self-interest, whether or not affirmative action helps their own group or not. Do you think that that might be an appropriate way to look at how people are talking about affirmative action?
Yeah, I actually do agree that that's an appropriate way to look at it. Obviously, when you pose any question about politics, the first thing people ask is like, well, how does it affect me? How does it affect people like me? And so I agree with you on both sides. A lot of people say, well, affirmative action will keep my kids out of college or make it harder for my kids to go to college, whereas some other groups might say, well, it'll make it easier for my kids to be in college. And so I think that the whole question about tribalism is that, yes, it does take place. But if we're going to look at how to best address the problem, and if we're to take a look at, take a holistic view of how affirmative action affects people, I think we have to get beyond that.
So I guess from what you're saying, you think that affirmative action is a policy that is damaging across the board to Asian Americans, to Blacks, Latinos, to white Americans. Basically, everybody you think is damaged by an affirmative action based college admission system, or one that includes affirmative action as part of holistic review. Is that accurate?
Yes, that is accurate. One thing I might add, and I just want to add this in because I don't know if we're going to get to it, is that affirmative action in itself is not necessarily always the wrong solution. Sometimes it is the right solution. But in the case of college admissions, it's the wrong solution.
Okay, so that sounds to me a little bit like you're saying that there are situations where you would support affirmative. Those are two questions. I mean, one is, it sounds as if there's a situation where you might support affirmative action, and second, do you distinguish between race-conscious affirmative action and affirmative action policies that don't include race?
Yeah. So let me. I guess I'll address the first question. Are there situations where I would support affirmative action? And so, for the purpose of this podcast, I wrote down three criteria, three guidelines that ought to be met if you're going to have some sort of racial affirmative action plan in place. And if you look, something that I didn't mention is that if you look at Wikipedia and or actually if you just type in affirmative action into Google, the first thing that comes up is a Wikipedia entry which defines it as positive discrimination. You've also seen it called reverse discrimination. And I think that's accurate because you have to understand that whenever, I mean, even in these situations where I believe it is probably the best solution, whenever you have a policy that is reverse discriminatory or discriminatory, in any case it is discriminatory. So if you say that even if affirmative action is done exactly as people intend it to, whereas you take one person over another because you're trying to diversify, it still discriminates against someone, because in all cases really, we're talking about a zero-sum game. And so
I think that's really interesting, because I actually don't think that it's so cut and dry that admissions is a zero-sum game, because the idea isn't that when one person gains, one person loses. I mean, you're building a class it's a more comprehensive, more holistic look at it. But I did really quickly want to jump to, I just received a tweet from Alton Wang, who is watching the show right now, and did ask whether or not you could actually clarify why you don't support affirmative action in college-based admissions a bit more before we go into affirmative action elsewhere. So why do you think that college admissions is a specific situation where you think affirmative action is not appropriate, regardless of whether or not it's a zero-sum game?
So I should probably continue this thought, because I think it's probably the best way to answer that.
Yeah.
It is a zero-sum game, because you're talking about a limited number of college. I mean, any college that you're talking to, they could only take a set number of people, and so you're talking about a limitation there. It's not like we will take everybody. Even if they wanted to take everybody, they couldn't take everybody. But I was going to say that there are three guidelines where I think that affirmative action based on race, positive racial discrimination, is acceptable. And the three guidelines that I have is that there has to be unequal opportunity to entry. So it has to be more difficult for someone of one minority to get in than another. Number two, the members of the in-group have to serve some kind of public function. So, for example, the Supreme Court, they serve a public function because they are catering to the masses. They are representative of American people. So, and a police force, that would be another example. A police force would be a good example of where the members of the in-group serve a public function. And the third criteria that I have is that the in-group does not waive its main benchmark for entry. And so, like, let's say you wanted a diverse police force, and police officer training is asking people to be able to shoot a moving target at 20 feet. I don't believe that you should ever lower that benchmark for certain races over others. And so those are the three criteria. And so Going into the your question about when I think it is acceptable, I actually came up with an example from Portland, Oregon. In Portland, there's a group. It's like an athletic club called the Multnomah Athletic Club, and it's a highly, highly exclusive club. It costs like $10,000 just for your initiation fee. I don't know what they charge after that. You could tell I'm not a member of this exclusive club, but
who has the money to pay for exclusive clubs?
yeah. I had to spend my $10,000 elsewhere. But anyway, they have in terms of Portland itself is a fairly white city. It's one of the whitest small big cities in the country. They call it a small big city because it's not really a big city, but it's not really a small city either. And so in most cases, if you want to get into the Multnomah Athletic Club, what you need to do is you need to get another member to sponsor you. And once that member sponsors you, they put your name into a hat. And they put lots of names into a hat, and then they pull names out randomly. And so it's very hard to get in. I mean, and it's also a zero-sum game. They cap their membership at X number of people, including kids, really. And so it's very hard to get in. But you can actually get in through the diversity program. And so what the diversity program is that it's the same exact thing. You still have to get a member to sponsor you. You have to get someone to say, I've known this person for 3 years, I am a member in good standing for at least the past year, and I can vouch for Byron Wong's character. He's a good person, and he pays his bills on time. And that's what they're looking for. But if you're a minority, you don't have to go into the hat. You can bypass the whole lottery system. And so that's a form of affirmative action, which I think meets all three of my criteria. One of the reasons why they have that is because it's not merit-based. I mean, I don't just take a test to see if I get into the Multnomah Athletic Club. I actually have to know someone, and the reality is that Portland is a mostly white city, and most of the people who were historically part of the Multnomah Athletic Club, they didn't really have a diverse group of friends, a diverse sphere. And so, it meets that criteria because there is a very unequal opportunity to entry. Number two, members of the in-group serve some kind of public function. Multnomah Athletic Club, they brand themselves as being the Portland club, the most exclusive Portland club. They cannot lay claim to that if they have an exclusively white membership. And so for that reason, they serve a public function as to be the place to be. An example of what they do, for example, is if you're a member.
I think that your metaphors, I understand what you're trying to say, and I actually want to bring it a little bit back to the universities, if that's okay.
Can I just get to the third point?
Sure. You can bring it to the third point.
Yeah, the in-group doesn't waive its main benchmark for entry. I mean, you still have to be sponsored by someone who can vouch for your good character. It's not like, hey, let's just take some minority off the street. Let's just take Byron because he's Chinese. It doesn't work that way. You still have to have someone vouch for your character. And so it meets all three criteria for when positive racial discrimination is acceptable. So go ahead.
So there's a lot to unpack there, but I actually do want to bring it back to the public university system, because let's take as a sort of benchmark your idea that affirmative action would be appropriate in these three situations. I actually think what you've described perfectly describes a public university system. I mean, you've described whether or not a place has unequal opportunity to entry. Well, there's ample studies that show unfair or segregated public school systems in the K through 12 system in California or nationwide. I mean, I just published a post online that shows that in the California system, where public high schools are graded by the AAPI index, which you can argue whether or not it's an appropriate index, but it's an index of quality of high schools. And Black and Latino students have access to roughly half the quality of high school as white and Asian students do. And in fact, it segregates across race, such that poor white and Asian students actually have better access to better quality high schools than the richest of the Black and Latino students. This is in California, in UCLA, where Prop 209 eliminated race-conscious affirmative action. So if we have a college system that is supposed to cater to California students, we do have applicants who have unequal opportunity to entry based on starting from unequal starting positions relative to the quality of their K through 12 education. The second issue is whether or not, you said whether or not these groups have a public function or serve some sort of public good. Well, I think that perfectly describes the public university system, because the purpose there is to provide education to all of California or provide access to higher education for all California residents. And they can't do that unless they have a diverse student body, because these are the taxpayers who are paying the predominant amount of these public education, these public institutions' budgets. I mean, these are not private institutions where most of the money is coming from donations or endowments. These are tuition-based universities where the intention is to create a broad increase in higher education. So there definitely is a motivation to increase the public good. And then finally, we can talk about whether or not these universities are waiving their standards of entry. And we can definitely say that if you look at the quality of these students are all performing above their baseline cutoff of SAT scores, if you think SATs are important. They're all performing above the baseline cutoff for GPA. And they all also have to have high extracurriculars, they have to have other good qualities, they have to write good essays, they have to have good reference letters. I mean, the quality of student that gets in under a race-conscious affirmative action program are not going to be the bottom of the barrel, and they're certainly not going to be getting in based on racial quotas alone, because we've already had several Supreme Court decisions that tell us that quota-based systems are unconstitutional. So if that's happening, nobody in the pro-affirmative action camp is going to defend that. So based on your three criteria, you seem to actually be arguing in favor of affirmative action at public institutions. Do you?
Yeah, I basically disagree with everything you just said. With
not surprisingly, this is why we're having this podcast, right?
Yeah. Dinner conversation, right?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, with the exception of maybe number two to a certain point, and which I'll get into in just a second, but unequal opportunity to entry, nobody's really proven that to me or to really anyone. I mean, I had a good friend in college, and it was funny. He was a blast. He was just a lot of fun to hang out with because he was just so quick-witted and smart. And he was a Chinese guy. He was like 5'4". He talked really, really fast, and but he was kind
of like me. I talk really fast when I get excited.
Yeah. But he was like a guy's guy, and so he was like unfiltered. I mean, like the profanity that came from his mouth is hilarious. But the thing is that he was we all used to joke because he was really quick-witted, but he would always get easily flustered, and we used to just joke around with him. But we found out that he was the valedictorian of his high school. And we were just like, no way. We were just kidding around with him. And I found out that he actually went to a very, very poor inner city school. And it was a predominantly African American population, the school, similar to South Philly, which you and I have blogged about before. Mm-hmm. And I actually had a roommate who was in a similar situation. He went to a predominantly African American school, and he was also valedictorian. And we just used to joke around with them because the culture was very different. I mean, my friend, if you covered your eyes and you spoke with him, you probably wouldn't know he was Chinese, just because of the way he spoke. He picked up the language of the people that were around him, and I just don't see how you can make the argument that someone like him somehow had some sort of better school when he went to the same exact school as everybody else. I mean, I understand, and we could go into the causes of this, this achievement gap, but I don't see how you can make that argument that somehow he magically pulled all these resources from his high school, whereas everyone else couldn't. I mean, he went to a predominantly African American high school, and he made it work. And the same with my roommate. He went to a predominantly African American high school. It was not easy for them.
I mean, to be fair, though, we're not really talking about your roommates, though. We're talking about in the aggregate, right?
Well, why aren't we talking about my roommates? There are just so many. I mean, these are two people that I know out of many, and I'm sure there are tons of people like them who. And my mom is a good example of that too. My mom went to a school that wasn't so rich, and I don't think it was predominantly African American, but it wasn't so rich. But she went further than a lot of her friends because she was able to pull the resources from wherever they came, and she was able to focus on what she needed to focus on. And so, I don't buy the argument that there's unequal opportunity to entry. I mean, there have been studies after studies about college admissions and whether African Americans, and these are studies by affirmative action supporters who've looked into whether or not African Americans face discrimination in the application process, and study after study says no, they don't. They don't. I mean, the only thing that that affirmative action supporters are relying on is saying that, well, they come from lesser schools. But if you look at the Asian kids who go to those lesser schools, a lot of them manage to do just fine.
So I think there's a lot to unpack there. I think one of possibly.
I haven't even got to the third bullet point, but go ahead.
I know. Well, yeah. I mean, that's why I said this is going to be a back and forth, right?
Yeah.
So, I think one of my frustrations is trying to have a conversation about macro level trends. And actually, Alton, who is very active on Twitter right now, is tweeting and saying that there's a big difference between talking about macro level trends versus micro level trends. And he also says study after study shows there is unequal access in education relative to how minorities are able to get in. So that's 2 points where, I mean, you're saying study after study shows no bias, and he's saying study after study does show bias. Now, obviously, this is a situation.
We're talking about the admissions process, though. I don't know if he's talking about saying that African Americans tend to have less resources in high school. He's not talking about admissions.
Well, I'll let him tweet back because I'm sure he's listening right now. I would say that I have read the studies that show bias relative to admissions, particularly if you look at outcome. I mean, if you look at California, I think California is a great test case for the effect of affirmative action on college admissions. And one of my most popular posts just looked at numbers, and it really was just looking at how admission rates changed before and after affirmative action, which is before 1997 and then after the effect of Proposition 209 in 1998. And what we saw was that with race-conscious affirmative action in place, you had admission rates that were approximately 80% across the board, which is appropriate considering if you think that, candidates from all different races are coming in with relatively similar qualifications, which implies race, just in terms of getiveness, and gumption is a race-neutral concept, which is what the admissions process is intending to find, is whether or not these people are go-getters or hardworking. After 1998, you see that the admission rates for Black and Latino and Native students, as well as Filipino students and Pacific Islander students, drops by 5 to 10% across the UC board system and by as much as 30% in UC Berkeley and other more competitive schools. And that's in 1 year. And the only thing that really describes that is that under a system where race is no longer able to be seen, you're creating this unequal opportunity to entry for these candidates. I mean, ultimately, there's really only two interpretations for that. One, there's unequal opportunity to entry, and this decrease in admission rates is a reflection of unequal starting points for certain minorities over others. Or the other way to interpret those data is that you think that these candidates are naturally more inferior. So, and that's the way that I right? So
you're drawing. Yeah, those aren't the only two. those aren't the only two possibilities. Go ahead.
So, I mean, how do you explain that as not an example of a non-race conscious affirmative action system not biasing the process against certain minority groups?
Well, you see, you and Alton and a lot of these other affirmative action supporters, you're looking at the outcome, and you're not looking at the opportunity. The opportunity is you get good grades, you have high test scores, and then you get in. That's the opportunity. We could look at. I know affirmative action supporters hate this, but we could look at the NBA. NBA is 75% black. Is it because Asian people are discriminated against? Is it because white people are discriminated against? It could be, but I highly doubt it. I mean, I think it just happens to be that there are more talented African Americans trying out and working hard. I mean, just off the top of my head, I know very few Asian Americans who, even as a kid, wanted to become, wanted to be in the NBA. So I mean, you can't only look at the outcome. I mean, and I'll throw this in because like I said, I realize that we're pressed for time and I might not get a chance to actually share this, but I think diversity is a great goal. I mean, I think that it's great to have a diverse workforce. It's great to have a diverse college campus, but you can't just look at the outcome. You have to look at the opportunity. And when you look at the opportunity is equal for everyone right now.
I actually completely disagree with that. First of all, I do kind of take a little bit of umbrage to the idea that African Americans are working really hard to be in the NBA but not in school. But that aside, like I don't think that really reflects it. But if we are seeing the statistic that
there's also a stat that Asian Americans are trying less hard to be in the NBA, but yeah,
sorry,
I mean.
what?
There's also the idea that Asian Americans are trying a little bit less hard to be part of the NBA. And I do want to bring this up because I think at some point during this 1 hour episode we're going to talk about culture, and I just wanted to open it up for right now.
We're like 30 minutes in, but like
okay, we might not have a chance then.
So, but I mean, in terms of whether or not, I mean, I think you're arguing a bootstrap argument. I think you're saying, you know, if minority students just worked harder, they would be able to get in. And I think that denies the structures of oppression and racism that we see time and time again reflected throughout our public school system in K through 12 and in college and in the workplace. Like, again, I cite the study that shows that Black and Latino students are segregated geographically into regions and neighborhoods where they're having access to more to lower quality schools. How in those schools are they able? Are they supposed to you know, just work hard and get the same grades as a white or Asian student who's got a family income that's maybe $70,000 less than them, and yet are still able to attend better quality schools? We also have studies that show that Black students, even at preschool ages, are more likely to be suspended by 2 to 3 times the rate as non-Black students, and that has almost nothing to do with their behavior. I mean, when you look at the behaviors that they're being suspended for, they're being suspended for the same kinds of behaviors in kindergarten as the white students, but there's a presumption of Black criminality that faces them. They have lower median income level, lower public investment in the public schools that they're going to, and then we're asking them to compete on the SATs, and assuming that the SATs are meritorious, yet you know, studies show that SATs are very poor predictors. They only predict about 10% of grade or class performance, and they only really directly correlate with the income of the families. So
yeah, and that's another stat that's kind of been misleading, because you know, you're right in that, like, if you were to compare you and me, for example, and let's say, for example, Cornell typically takes students between 1350 and 1450 or whatever the numbers are, right?
Back when it was a 1600 thing.
I think it's going back to that, actually. I don't.
Really?
I heard.
I hope so, because I keep talking about it 1600 based scores, and I sound like I don't know what I'm talking about.
But yeah, you're correct. I mean, I can send you the link. There was an ABC report on that. Like, how is it possible that, like, the liberals and conservatives are getting this all so differently? The conservatives say that SATs are the best predictors of college performance, and then the liberals are saying no, it has no correlation whatsoever. And so the ABC did a report on it, and what it turns out is that if you were to compare someone with like a 1350 and then someone with, say, a 1420 or something like that, yeah, there's no correlation, because at that point they're of relatively equal levels, and so a lot of it's going to have to do with grit. It's going to have to do with you know, whether or not the person likes his or her field of study, and so
whether or not they had coffee that morning.
Whether or not they had coffee that morning, you know, whether or not they're you know, they get access to alcohol in college or whatever. But you know, it does, you know, and that's on the micro level. But the ABC report also showed that it also shows that the reason why the statistics are so muddied is because typically people who make it into a school that takes between, you know, 1400 and 1500, most of the kids are already there, so there's no correlation whatsoever. But if you were to take someone who got like a 900 or an 800 and you were to put them into the school that typically accepts only between 1400 and 1500, they would have trouble.
Yeah, I agree with you, except the problem is that the first scenario is how SATs are used. Like, there's no school in the world that's letting a student in that's 900. That gets to your third point about whether or not the schools will waive entry. And the way that holistic review works and college admissions process works is there's a baseline cutoff, and then everybody above that is considered baseline minimum qualified based on SAT scores. And then we're talking about minimum amounts of differences. I mean, even the mismatch theory that anti-affirmative action people like to tout are only talking about SAT score differences of 300, and they consider this massive racial preference. And the problem is that that doesn't even really describe it, because when you look at the median income or median SAT score differences between various racial groups, we're talking about on the score of at most 100 points. So we're talking about that small range that you cited as showing there's no difference in quality and qualifications in these students.
Yeah, if you look at Thomas Espenshade's work, I mean, he's talking about differences of like 450 points, which I think is pretty significant. You know, I took the SAT for the first time when I was in 7th grade, and I think I was in the lower half of, you know, my friends who took it, but I was still scoring around 1,000. And so, you know, I think that, you know, if you do look at that, and, you know, going back to the whole thing about Prop 209, is that when they enforced Prop 209, graduation rates for underrepresented minorities basically shot up. And so, you know, I do think that it's very hard to argue that.
But the admission went way down. Like, we're talking about a drop in absolute numbers of thousands of students. Before we want to turn away from the SAT score, I just did want to bring in what Alton Wong is saying, because he's watching, and he's been tweeting up a storm over here. And I appreciate it, Alton. Because he's got really great comments. He also wanted us to really quickly go over SAT prep. And he says, it's going back to the 1600 scale to answer that question, but what about access to SAT and ACT prep? And he says, I will say my SAT score pre-prep was about 400 points lower than post-prep, and that's my privilege that I could afford it. And it's true. Like, I didn't have SAT prep scores because I had access to a private high school, which basically served as 6 years worth of SAT prep. But that's not true for most students. Like, if we want to go into anecdote, we can talk about underrepresented minorities who are growing up in public high school systems where they don't have access to regular after-school SAT prep, and they don't even have access to the AP courses they need to compete. So again, we're getting at this idea of unequal opportunity. You've got different students coming from different backgrounds all being asked to compete as if they're not.
Yeah, and that's something that has also been very, very highly overstated, I believe, because, I mean, if you look at the whole issue that's going on right now in New York City, where Mayor de Blasio is trying to get rid of the test for the specialized high schools, something that affirmative action supporters keep bringing up is that, oh, well, you know, these Asian kids, they have access to test prep. You know, they can afford these private tutors who get them ready for the test. It's so unfair. It's so unfair. But if you look at it, and, you know, I actually know a lot of people who went to Stuyvesant, and very few of them, if any, I don't think I know of any who had access to test prep. I mean, basically, my friend who eventually became a lawyer, went to Georgetown, went to Cornell, then went to Georgetown. He basically said, well, what I did was I bought a book for whatever, $10 or however much it was there, and I just studied every single day for 2 hours, and that's how I got my test scores. You know, I just think it's overstated because, you know, look at Stuyvesant, look at their student population. 47% of them qualify for free or reduced lunch. I mean, these are not rich kids who are making it to Stuyvesant and then just flaunting their material wealth. These are kids who work very hard to get where they are. And, you know, it's just sad.
I think that there's some privilege there as well, though. I mean, like your friend who can afford to buy a book, which is in and of itself disposable income.
Well, $10?
Hey,
Dad, come on.
I both know that disposable income is not easy. Like, yeah, we're talking about $10, but we're talking about $10 for a family that's a fixed income that's maybe paying for food on food stamps. $10 could actually mean the difference between I get a book or I get to eat tonight. So, yeah, I mean, you and I are both talking about privilege as if $10 is not a big deal, but $10 is a big deal for some people. So that's one thing. And then also the second point is, like, this kid, this friend of yours, has the time to study. What about students who are part of families where they're forced to take a part-time job in order to bring food to the table, or they have to take care of their kids, their brothers and sisters, so that their mothers and fathers can continue to work full-time, non-traditional shift work? I mean, even though, you know, that sounds like a bootstrap story, and I don't want to discount how much work is involved in that, and I think that you and I have disagreed in the past because you think I'm doing that, and I'm really not. Like, I understand that's a lot of work, but even within that, that's a lot of privilege. I think one time we had a conversation on Facebook where you brought up a similar sort of example, and you were like, what about kids who play piano? Shouldn't they get credit for working really hard to play piano. And I said, yes, they should get a lot of credit for working really hard to master the piano, but when they're competing against students who don't have access to a piano and who don't have the time to practice, is it really a fair comparison? So there's privilege there and hard work at the same time. And what I think I'm trying to point out is that not every student has access to the privilege to be able to prove themselves. They don't have the same access to opportunity.
So let me answer those questions in reverse order. Like the whole thing about needing a job, I think I sent you a link about a month ago to an article in Time magazine by Jean Kwok, who's a best-selling New York Times best-selling author, and she is strongly against getting rid of the specialized test school because she went to Hunter High School, and yeah, I mean, you know, and if you know her story, she had to work in a sweatshop. I mean, she writes about it in her first book about, you know, it being cold all the time, her mom always making her work, and like, you know, there being, you know, mice and cockroaches and whatever in the apartment. I mean, yeah, I'm not saying that poor people have it easy. I'm also not saying that just because you're black you happen to be poor. I mean, I think that's something that...
No, I'm not saying that either.
I'm
absolutely not saying that either.
I know you're not saying that, but I think that's something that really needs to be put out there, because a lot of people say, well, what about poor? What about poor people? You know, we'll get to that. I know that you asked that question. We never got a chance to answer it, but class-based affirmative action, we'll get to that in just a second.
Yeah, I think we should probably switch over to that unless you want to finish up your thought.
Yeah, I wanted to jump to that $10 thing because... You know, the thing is, yeah, okay, $10, you know, for some people it could be money, but, you know, sometimes you have to make investments for your future, and if $10 makes a big difference later in life, I mean, you could look at the history of the Jews in the U.S. When they first came here, a lot of them were not rich, but it's like you make the investment to do it. I mean, I don't know if you remember a few years back, Oprah Winfrey gave money to start a school in Africa. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know if you remember this because the media kind of glossed over it because it was something that I think they were very ashamed to say. But they said, well, Oprah, why don't you give money to schools here? There are a lot of African American kids in need of better schools, and you've got all this money. Why don't you give it? And then she says, well, I want to give my money where my money is wanted. Over here, they're only interested in shoes and iPods. And it would now that would totally be, if anybody other than Oprah Winfrey said that, it would totally be construed as being racist. But it's something that has to be considered because, you know, you look at, like, are you saying that black people don't have access to iPods? Or I guess they're not iPods anymore. I guess they're iPads now. But are you saying that they don't buy shoes? I mean, that's the thing. That's what I'm talking about. When, you know, and I sent you an article also about a guy named Ting Shi who, you know, his parents worked in the laundromat, and they just make sacrifice after sacrifice after sacrifice. Now, whether or not you think that that is a good sacrifice to make, I mean, you know, it's anybody's free to have their own opinion. But the point is that they make these huge sacrifices in order for their kids to succeed. And these sacrifices, you can't take it away from them. These are these parents' dreams. These are these kids' dreams to make it big, and they've got every right to that anyone else does.
And I'm not saying that they don't have any right to it, but what I'm pointing out is that in the ability to quote unquote make sacrifices is some inherent privilege. Like, what I find really disconcerting is, you know, the juxtaposition that we just made between the hardworking, sacrificing Asian parent versus, I don't know if you mean to say this, but, you know, black communities that are spending all their money on shoes and iPods, which I don't think is really reflective of how that dynamic really works. And I just don't want us to be going down this path where we're trying to argue against affirmative action and we end up alienating other communities with our rhetoric. And in part of that, I kind of wanted to read this tweet that I got before the show started from Slacker Jeweler, who wrote, I support affirmative action, and shouldn't Asian Americans as well? Wouldn't more equality help Asian Americans too? And then she knows that she is black. I assume Slacker Jeweler is a woman. I actually don't remember. I'm sorry, Slacker Jeweler, if you're listening. But when I wrote back, they said, I don't want to debate on whether I'm allowed to take up space in my own country. And I think Slacker Jeweler is bringing up a pretty interesting point. And then Snoopy Jenkins, who is also African American, wrote, and I kind of read this comment earlier, but I'll read it again. Doesn't the argument that Asians lose from affirmative action assume that Asian Americans deserve public investment over underrepresented minorities? And I think the common thread in both of these comments is how is Asian American opposition to affirmative action and how we talk about this conversation reflecting upon our community and how we interact with other communities who are really excluded from public education now under non-race conscious affirmative action policies, and who really find the rhetoric that we use maybe consciously, maybe unconsciously, slightly racially charged.
Yeah, and you know that's kind of that's kind of a false comparison that that those two are making, because you know the thing is that when we talk about race conscious affirmative action, we're usually only talking about the most selective schools. There are open enrollment schools that will take you if you can demonstrate a certain amount of preparation for college. And so, and who pays for that? The taxpayers pay for that. And so it's not like, it's not like anybody is saying or even fighting for policies that would totally prevent African American kids from getting college educations. One thing that I did want to mention too, and I don't know how this is going to figure into the conversation. I recently blogged about a young woman named Chanel Davis, who this past year, she's African American, and this past year she was valedictorian of Cardozo High School in Queens, New York. And Cardozo is one of these schools that doesn't really get a lot of mention in the news because it's not one of the specialized schools, but it is a zone school, which means that people can take tests to get in. And because Chanel Davis is from Jamaica, she probably did take that test to get in. And I was very excited because I'm like, oh wow, here is an African American who has made it. She's become, and I know a lot of kids from, they're not kids anymore, but I know a lot of people from Cardozo High School, and they are bright. My roommate, one of my other roommates from college, was actually from Cardozo High School too, and he was one of those guys with the reputation where people hated him because he never had to study. He just basically looked at it and, okay, that's great, I'm ready for the test. And he would go in, get 100, and people would be like, oh man, you jerk, how could you do that? You just blew the curve on us. But the thing is that he wasn't valedictorian. I mean, he went there, he was not valedictorian of Cardozo. Cardozo is a highly, highly, highly competitive school. And Chanel Davis got not second place, not third place, she got number 1. And I was reading about her life story, and it turns out that her parent, and part of it was a little disappointing me because I was just like, oh, here's an African American who has done it. She's like, descended from slaves in this country, and somehow she found a way to overcome it, and now she's going to, show the world how to do it. And she was very conscious about her historical place. She's like, I'm the very first African American ever to become valedictorian of Cardozo. This is a great achievement. But then I read about her family history, and it turns out that her parents are from Haiti, and basically they were tiger parents. She's like, yeah, my parents, they basically made me study all the time, and I was talking to another friend from Cardozo. He's just like, you could change her name to Byron Wong or Jen Fang, and it would make no difference because she had Asian parents. And so I mean that's something that really is not coming out at all in this debate. I mean, everything is about how stacked the system is, whereas you see these African Americans who actually succeed. John DeBerry is another one. John DeBerry, he won a MacArthur Genius Fellowship for his work, and he too is the son of African, I believe it's Africans from Africa, and so I mean, there's a lot in this debate that people are just not considering and not really working to try to understand. And so, I really just don't buy this whole thing that, well, it just can't be done, because obviously people are doing it. It's just
but I think the problem is that you're citing like special cases where you've got these individuals and then you're pointing out their parents, but you're not. I think that you're missing the trends, the larger trends of how social systems impact childhood upbringing, and how larger socioeconomic factors can disadvantage people by and large. That also being said, though, I also think that on the other hand, I don't think that it's appropriate to suggest that there's something exceptional or special about an African American student who achieves well. I mean, you and I both went to Cornell, where we were surrounded by African American students who got through maybe on COSEP, maybe didn't, but either way, once they got there, were highly talented and skilled. It's not as if these are like rare golden geese in the African American community. I remember there was one study I read. I think what you're trying to get at is this idea of tiger parenting, and basically, if minority parents parented better, their kids would be smarter.
Well, I'm not saying better. I'm not saying better. I'm just saying that you get what you and I have an African American commenter on my blog. He's like number 2 in charge. I mean, he's basically, his name is King. I think you've probably read some of his comments. And
I'm very popular on your blog.
Yeah, everybody loves you.
Right. But let me just finish this point though, because I think that the issue is this presumption or this myth of the absentee or less invested black parent or Latino parent. I remember there was a study that showed that when I think it was actually by Jennifer Lee, either she shared it or she authored it, I can't quite remember, but basically the point of the study, she authored it actually, and the point of the study was when you looked at families that were 2-parent families within the community across all races, you actually found that African American families were equally as likely to invest in their kids or more so. That really the correlation here wasn't racial or cultural, it was socioeconomic, because when you have two-parent families and 2-parent households, that's a different socioeconomic status. And when you're poorer, you're less likely to have 2 parents, one of whom can actually have the time to invest in the household upbringing of children, and who are basically able to create a strong parenting household. This is a socioeconomic point, is what I'm saying. And when you take those factors away, those socioeconomic factors away, you actually there's no cultural difference in how these different families are investing in their children. So that doesn't really explain, like, this whole idea that Asians are just more focused on educating our kids. That doesn't really explain, it's not really borne out by the data. The data suggests that there's no cultural difference in that.
Yeah, and I would beg to differ on that. I mean, having come from Asian parents, I know how rough Asian parents can be. I've never heard of.
Right, but I mean, I assume you've never dealt with African American parents, right? I mean, you don't really know.
Well, okay, yeah, I do deal a lot with African American parents. Most of them are, because I live in Portland, most of them are African Americans married to white parents. So I don't know if that really counts. And I'll be the first to admit that. The thing is, Jen, you have to look at what is really going on here. I mean, you very rarely see African American parents talk about the whole tiger parenting thing as often as Asian American parents do. And I do believe that Asian American parents, and this is all anecdotal anyway, because there's no way to really conduct a study on this. I do believe that Asian American parents tend to be among the strictest of parents.
Well, that's why I brought up Jennifer Lee's study, because she actually did study that, and she did find that parental investment was pretty equal across the races.
Yeah, that's not really a cut or dry thing, though. I mean, what is equal? I mean, did she do it in terms of how much money they spent? Did she do it on, like, how many after-school programs they went to? I mean, it's one of these things that's really nebulous, because I mean, when I look at, like, even in my own parenting, a lot of it has to do with. Let me give you an example. So, for example, like, my son does chess. People who read my blog know. Some parents, very early on, they will pay for a private chess tutor, a private chess coach. They'll hire a master for $100 an hour, and this master will just teach their kid their 6-year-old chess or 7-year-old chess. And I never did that. I basically told my son last year, well, we're not ready for that. I'm just going to show you how to do it. And so, how do you really measure it? I mean, I would look like, in a study, I would look like the absentee parent because I didn't invest any money in chess coaching lessons. But otherwise, in another study, I might look like the good parent because I'm the one who actually spends time with my kid going over his chess games. So, I mean, it's one of these things where if
I remember the study correctly, I think it was hours spent parenting with the child. But, for anyone listening, I will try to make the link available so that we can verify for sure. Because I don't want to talk about a study that I only read very briefly a long
time. That it sounds to me, and I'll wait for the link, of course, but it sounds to me that's self-reported. And, as a parent, I could say something. I'm just like, man, I spent the last 4 hours with my son trying to go over, his math test, and it's not 4 hours. It feels like 4 hours, but it's more like an hour and a half that just seemed to drag on. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that this is probably a nice segue to go into the final point, which I think is the data associated. One thing I really did want to get you to talk about a little bit was, one of our biggest disagreements in the last month was how much support affirmative action has within the Asian American community. And it actually got pretty contentious. So the first thing I'm going to do is apologize for getting pretty contentious between us. And I don't think that that's appropriate. One of the things I wanted to talk to you about was how to elevate the tone within our community and to really get at talking about data rather than talking about, I mean, with all due respect, anecdote is one of those things where it's a nice story, but I can't verify your story. And it doesn't reflect national trends. So there's almost nothing I can say. It's one of those rhetorical devices that is designed to, I think, make it more difficult for the person you're talking to really have a conversation, because I can't be like, no, your friend didn't say that, And so all I can say is I appreciate your story, but that's not what the data say. So, I really wanted to talk to you about, I have these data that say that roughly 60% to 70% of Asian Americans support affirmative action. You disagree with that. So maybe we can talk about the use of data in our community relative to how we have this conversation.
Yeah, and my point was only over that one study that you kept citing with Karthik Ramnakrishnan. Karthik, I mean, and this is a point that I kind of wanted to make online, but I know that when I type it, it doesn't always come out the way that I want you to read it, and so.
No, I mean, there's. Who was saying it? Something about on online, everybody sounds like an asshole, and I'm guilty of that too. So it's okay. I got heated, you got heated. It's water under the bridge. It's all good.
No wonder I have no friends. But,
I wouldn't say that.
Well, what I was saying is that Karthik. I mean, and this is a point that I was trying to make, because I said that he's a very, very highly charged advocate for affirmative action. He should not be conducting these kinds of studies, because I don't really trust his data, and you said, well, if you're saying that, then you're accusing him of being dishonest, and that's you better come up with something to really substantiate that. And my point was that I'm not accusing him of being dishonest, and I was trying to come up with an example that could illustrate exactly what I feel when it comes to Karthik, because I know some of the things that he has said, some of the articles that he's forwarded and stuff like that. I mean, I kind of know, and I've read a lot by him and quotes by him. Something that I guess an example that I would bring up is Sean Hannity. All right. So Sean Hannity, when I hear him say something on the radio, do I think he's lying? No. I mean, do I agree with him? Well, no. I disagree with probably 90% of what he says. But that guy is so highly charged that he can't really. If he were to conduct a study, a poll, and say, hey, I just conducted a poll that shows that, all these people are against Obama or whatever, I wouldn't trust it. I would ask them to repeat it, and that's kind of my feeling with Karthik. It's not that I don't trust him. It's more that I just would ask him to, for a non-biased source to repeat it. Sean Hannity, continuing the example, right after Obama was elected president, right after he went into office, 2 months afterwards, Sean Hannity's on the air. Oh, the economy's in shambles. It's terrible. The stock market is really, really low, and people can't find jobs. Okay, and so now years later in 2014, and I heard him just maybe like a few months ago. The economy's in shambles. People can't get jobs, and he totally doesn't say anything about the fact that the stock market is through the roof. I mean, Sean Hannity's a rich man. You would think that he would be able to see that, and that's exactly the thing. Is that I think that certain people, and Jen, I actually consider you and I among this group, because I wouldn't trust me to do a study on affirmative action. I wouldn't trust you either. We're just so highly charged, and we have our own ways of looking at things that I think that for certain things, especially for something like that, you would have to have a non-biased source look into it. And I'm not saying that I think that Asian Americans are against or for. I happen to believe that we're mostly against, but I'm not saying that this is something I would stake my life on. I'm saying that it's just something that people should look into a little bit more.
Yeah, well, I think that, I come at this from a scientist's perspective, and I think one of the places that we disagreed is I don't think that it's possible to have a truly unbiased anybody. Like, you know, I do biology and physiology in my day job. And even you would think, I guess most lay people would think that's not a place where you can have strong opinions, but that's really far from the truth. Like, every scientist comes in carrying biases about what they think. If they formed a hypothesis about what's happening, they have a bias. And
Yes.
most scientists would like their hypotheses to be true. And so what I was trying to point out was that if you, in the scientific community, if you think that someone has allowed their biases to taint their study, that's why we publish the methodology. You know, like every scientific study publishes methodology for this explicit purpose, because it's fair game to criticize a study and to say it got biased somehow. But then you have to point out how in the methodology the bias was allowed to skew the data, because every investigator has bias. And the idea of building a strong methodology is to immunize it or inoculate it from the biases of the investigators. And that's why I really brought that up. Not really to say, like, not trying to start any shit, but really just to be like, if you have a problem with Karthik's methodology, or you think that he has been biased in some way, it really does become your responsibility, just in terms of how scientific dialogue happens, to point out where in the methodology it's been flawed. And I did that too when I first saw the AAPI data. Like, I was like, I would like to know more about, you know, specific techniques and methods that he used to convince myself that I believed it. And so that's why I was asking you, if you see something wrong with it, you should point it out.
You have to realize that we're not talking about the physical sciences here. Usually in the physical sciences, if someone does something, let's say I claim to, you know, invent some new form of fusion or something, and then someone could test it and see, well, does it work or not? In this case, I would say the same thing. Just test it. I mean, it's not a big deal. I don't take it personally. I hope you don't either. I hope Karthik doesn't. But
no. I mean, that's my point. Yeah. It's not a personal criticism, but it is part of scientific dialogue to be able to point out where you disagree with the methods.
Well, we're not talking about physical sciences here. I mean, there's a reason why. I mean, Glenn Beck and Sean Hannity are very rich men, but they do not conduct polls, and there's a reason, because it's just so tainted. I mean, you look at like, for example, you mentioned that all researchers, all pollsters, whatever, they have biases, and it's true. I mean, Daniel Golden, who I do trust. I mean, I've read some of his stuff. He's a supporter of affirmative action, and he reports it as it is. And Thomas Espenshade also. He's actually a supporter of affirmative action too. All these people that I'm quoting today are supporters of affirmative action.
And actually, I try to tell people, Espenshade denies that his study was proof of anti-Asian bias. I have it, like, underlined up at the top.
Well, yeah, and I wasn't talking about that part.
But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, there are you know, Daniel Golden has stuff that say, you know, other stuff as well. And Espenshade has also said, I mean, he's also said that affirmative action does allow less qualified applicants to get into the system at the expense of more qualified applicants. And so I don't know exactly how much of his focus has been on the whole Asian thing. But what I'm saying is that, you know, these people have biases, but they're very, very small biases. I mean, there's just, like, you know, they're mainly people who kind of tilt a little bit to one side, or, you know, I wish they would tilt in the other, but, you know, they tilt a little bit to one side, and, you know, so they're just slightly off center. Whereas, you know, with other people, like if you were to talk to a Glenn Beck or a Sean Hannity, they are just, or a Jen Fang or a Byron Wong, we're just, like, way on the sides, and, you know, the whole idea of polls should be done by people who
right,
are,
but
you know,
I think, and I'm sorry, but, like, I think that Karthik's study wasn't a poll in the same sense that I think you're talking about it. Like, it was a scientifically conducted study. It wasn't just like CNN put a web poll up, you know? Like, he had a team of investigators. He had a list of questions. He picked his respondents based on voter registration. I mean, and he had thousands. I struggled because I initially thought it was a far too high a number, and I was very skeptical. And so I went through the same process where I, like, combed through his methods and was like, how is this possible? And I was convinced that, you know, if there is a bias that he has, he didn't bring it to the data table. And that's what I'm saying. Like, you will have very strong opinions in social sciences as well as in the physical sciences. Like, even in the physical sciences, we have the capacity to bias our data just through interpretation.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And experimental design. So, like, I really think that he conducted a very comprehensive study and is... And he's not even the only one. I mean, your other point was whether or not it's been replicated. It actually was predated by I think 3 or 4, maybe even more, smaller studies that looked at Asian Americans responding on college campuses or in smaller geographic regions. Like I keep citing a couple small ones, and I don't have them off the top of my head, but with smaller survey groups, it replicates this approximate 2/3 breakdown. And then the other data I gave you were like, when Prop 209 was being passed, 60% of Asian Americans voted against Prop 209 in favor of keeping affirmative action around. And then that's more noteworthy because it replicates not just the trend, but the actual breakdown of the number that Karthik reports as well.
Well,
so,
yeah, I mean, yeah, and to repeat my point, I mean, if his data, if that data is, if Karthik as a highly biased source is able to get it, I think it should be able to be replicated by a non-biased source. I mean, that's just my point. And it's just like, I personally don't accept it, but, you know, yeah, and in terms of like the whole debate over whether or not affirmative action is good for people, you know, it really doesn't affect, you know, my view anyway, what other people think. And so, yeah, so just to close that, I mean, I think that, you know, you should be able to replicate it, or someone should be able to replicate it. So, Jen, I just realized I didn't and I know we're coming up on time.
Yeah, and I actually have one more comment. Actually, desperately needs to get in here in the last 3 minutes.
Sure.
Did you want to say something, or?
Well, yeah, and I'll keep it really short. I think the first question is, how does this negatively affect African American people, affirmative action? And we've been spending, you know, us selfish Asians have been talking about Asian people the whole time. So you know, the thing is that, you know, you look at the test scores of African Americans and just general academic achievement. You know, if you have an affirmative action policy that is going to sway the outcome without looking at the reasons for the outcome, African Americans are just not going to get the help they need to raise those test scores and to help improve their academic standing so that they can compete on equal grounds with other people. And that was the point that I kind of wish I had a little bit more time to make, but I at least I can at least say it here.
Well, I mean, this is a big topic, and that's part of why I desperately need to sneak this in. Belinda Lum on Twitter notes, they're having a conversation on Twitter about us right now, and they say the problem with the question of the podcast is that it assumes Asian Americans aren't underrepresented minorities. And I think that is a really critical point that also is lost in how we have this debate. We use the word Asian American as if it reflects all people who are Asian American. So we use the word Asian American and Chinese, Korean, Japanese, South Asian as if they're synonymous. And we are ignoring all of the South Asians and all of the Pacific Islanders who are within our diaspora, who have socioeconomic factors that are much more similar to underrepresented minorities. Like if you look at Filipinos, Hmong, Cambodian, Laotians, they're all underrepresented and have admission rates that are much, much lower than your standard, you know, Chinese, Japanese, Korean kind of Asian that we're sort of implicitly assuming that we're talking about. And yet I find this really marginalizing because it assumes that all Asian Americans are these quote-unquote high achiever Asian Americans, and we're basically ignoring the experiences of all of the Southeast Asians and Pacific Islanders who are really struggling and whom we would presume, if SCA 5 were to pass in California, for example, would actually benefit from affirmative action because they basically are underrepresented minorities in California. So do you want to talk a little bit about how we seem to gloss over an entire subset of the Asian American community?
So somebody actually sent me, and I'm you know, again, I apologize. I just got the I just got your itinerary last night.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, and I just got his email last night as well. It seems like everybody was emailing at the last moment. But he actually sent me data that showed at UC Berkeley, you know, the Vietnamese are not underrepresented, proportional to their for UC Berkeley, that is, they're not underrepresented relative to their population in the state of California. And he said it's true across the board for all of the categories of Asian Americans at UC Berkeley, or at least if they make a category. I mean, I don't know if they actually make one for Hmong or, you know, or Mien or something.
That's the problem, right? We're not including Hmong, Laotian.
Yeah.
If you look at the UC data, the problem with it is that they disproportionately had their boxes available over the course of the same period of time that we're looking at. So there's no comparison. There's no way to compare them past like 5 years, and even within those years, it's a moving target because
Yeah.
you didn't have the same number of checkboxes available. So I've seen those data, and I have a problem seeing any over the time trends in those data because it's hard to self-identify when you get different combinations of boxes every year.
Right, and you know, and a lot of researchers into affirmative action have been really frustrated, or at least they've said that they've been frustrated that the universities hide their data and are not really or not really very cooperative in sharing what they have to say, what their data has to say about minorities in the UC system. And so I would have to say that I agree with you there. I mean, it's just very hard when the data is when they keep changing the boxes or they just don't tell you what's really going on. And so. But for me, I don't really, like I said, I mean, when I talked about my NBA example, I don't really think that, Asian Americans are underrepresented in the NBA or African Americans are overrepresented. I think, they're just basically trying to get the people who are most qualified for the job, and those are the people who happen to, for whatever reason, those are the people who happen to apply. So, I mean, go ahead.
I think that I disagree with you. I mean, I think that where we agree is that we want to get college campuses full of students who are the most qualified. I think where we disagree is I don't think that the current system allows a current system without race-conscious affirmative action allows us to really get a fair measure of who is most qualified because it makes some very base assumptions like the playing field is equal, like the SATs are a meritorious system. And I wanted to close out on one of the final reader comments that I got, which was by Johnson Fan, who said, "Of course AAPIs should actively support affirmative action. Since when have race-blind policies ever been just?" And I don't want us to answer that question because we really have no more time, but I think that that reflects my position on it, which is to say that in the absence of race-conscious affirmative action, I don't think that we have a just system that meets your 3 criteria, which is that you have equal opportunity to access and that this institution serves the public function that's equal for all, and that you haven't altered your entry position in some way by excluding people. So, is there any final? We're winding down a little bit, and I had a chance to say what I thought. Is there anything else you want to throw in there?
Not really. I think I basically covered most of what we have. I mean, I'm sure if I start something else, it's going to go for another hour, and
well,
you're going to have to kick me out.
No, I'm really excited because I got a chance to start a podcast, and it was in part because you have this podcast going, and I really thought there was a lot of opportunities like this that get missed in like blogging conversations, written form, where you can't interact with someone and engage them and really have a back and forth conversation. So I want to thank you for coming on to this podcast and being here and being my first non-live-in guest on the podcast. And I really thought this was a really great conversation. And as with all of my other podcast topics, what we found at the end of the night is that we couldn't complete it all. So I just wanted to thank you, Byron, for coming, and thank all of the viewers who watched. I especially want to thank Alton Wang, who, like I said, was tweeting up a storm on Twitter, and it was really great material. And I'm sorry for anything I couldn't get to. I will try to post any additional reader comments I couldn't get to later on when this podcast goes out. And I also wanted to do a quick announcement for my next podcast, which is going to be airing on Wednesday, August 27th. The time's to be determined, and the question is, what is AAPI feminism? And to tackle that topic, I've invited Juliet Shen from the Fascinations blog, and so hopefully the two of us can really tackle the intersection of feminism and Asian American race activism. And so, Byron, I want to thank you again for coming out. And
yeah, thanks for having me, Jen. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you, and maybe we'll do this again, another sequel to this.
Sounds good.
All right, take care. Thank you.
Take care. Bye.